The moment Violet Patterson's fingers closed around the simple gold band on her left hand, she knew what had to be done, even as her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The winter of 1881 had descended upon the New Mexico territory with a fury that seemed personal, and the tiny shack she called home offered about as much protection as a sieve held water. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 months now, trampled by a spooked horse during a cattle drive, and the meager savings they'd scraped together had run out 2 weeks ago. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, and the cold was becoming dangerous. Through the frosted window, she could see old Mr. Henderson's wagon rolling down the rutted street of Pecos, loaded with firewood he was selling at prices only the well-off could afford. But Violet had nothing left to sell except the ring Thomas had placed on her finger 2 years ago, when they'd both been young and foolish and certain that love could conquer anything. She stepped out into the biting wind, her threadbare shawl doing little to protect her from the elements. At 22 years old, Violet had already learned that life in the West was cruel and unforgiving, especially to women without means or protection. The streets of Pecos were nearly deserted, most folks having the good sense to stay indoors, where fires kept the worst of the cold at bay. Her boots, worn thin at the soles, crunched through the frozen mud as she approached Henderson's wagon. "Mr. Henderson," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind, "I need to buy some firewood." The old man looked down at her from his perch, his face weathered like old leather, eyes narrowing as he took in her desperate appearance. "Cash only, Mrs. Patterson. No credit." Violet's hand trembled as she pulled the ring from her finger. The metal felt heavy, weighted with memory and love and everything she was about to lose. "I have this. It is real gold. My husband gave it to me." Henderson climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff in the cold. He took the ring from her palm, studying it with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen plenty of desperate transactions in his time. "Your husband, he died some months back, did he not?" "Yes, sir." The words came out barely above a whisper. "This ring, it will buy you enough wood to last maybe 3 weeks if you are careful with it." He looked at her with something that might have been pity, but could just as easily have been contempt. In places like Pecos, the line between the two was often thin. Violet nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Henderson loaded 6 heavy logs into her arms, the weight of them almost too much for her weakened body. She refused to let them fall, refused to show just how close to the edge she really was. The ring disappeared into Henderson's pocket, and with it went the last physical reminder of Thomas, the last piece of the life they'd planned together. The walk back to her shack felt longer than it should have, each step requiring effort she wasn't sure she possessed. But she made it, pushed open the door, and dropped the logs beside the small iron stove that was the only thing keeping the place from being completely uninhabitable. As she fed one of the logs into the stove, watching the flames catch and grow, she allowed herself to cry for the first time since Thomas's death. The tears came hot and fast, and she didn't try to stop them. The warmth from the stove slowly filled the small space, and Violet wrapped herself in the thin blanket from her bed, sitting as close to the heat as she dared. She'd figure out what to do next tomorrow. Tonight, she would allow herself to grieve not just for Thomas, but for everything she'd lost and everything she'd never have. What she didn't know was that someone had watched her transaction with Henderson from across the street. Carter Preston had been coming out of the general store when he'd seen the young widow approach the wood cellar, had seen her remove the ring with shaking hands, had understood exactly what that gesture meant. At 30 years old, Carter owned one of the larger cattle ranches outside of Pecos, a spread he'd built up himself over the past decade through hard work and careful management. He'd seen Violet around town before, had noticed her even when she'd been married, though he'd never acted on that noticing. A man didn't disrespect another man's wife, not if he had any honor. But she was a widow now, and from the looks of things, she was in serious trouble. Carter had lost his own parents when he was young, had known what it was like to struggle and scrape by with nothing. He'd been lucky enough to find work with a rancher who'd taken him in, taught him the business, and eventually sold him the land when age made continuing impossible. Carter had never forgotten what it felt like to be desperate, and he'd sworn that if he ever had the means, he'd help others who found themselves in similar circumstances. He stood in the cold for a long moment, watching the thin stream of smoke beginning to rise from the chimney of Violet's shack. Then he made a decision. He walked down the street to Henderson's wagon, catching the old man before he moved on to his next customer. "That ring you just bought from Mrs. Patterson," Carter said without preamble. "I want to buy it back from you." Henderson's eyes gleamed with the prospect of profit. "That's so. Well, I gave her a fair price for it." "I am sure you did," Carter replied, his tone making it clear he thought no such thing. "How much?" They haggled for a few minutes, but Carter was a shrewd businessman, and Henderson knew better than to push too hard. The ring changed hands again, this time for a sum 3 times what Henderson had given Violet for it. Carter tucked it into his vest pocket and headed back to his horse. The ride out to his ranch gave him time to think about what he was doing and why. He wasn't a man given to impulsive gestures, but something about the look on Violet's face when she'd handed over that ring had struck him deep. Maybe it was because he understood loss, or maybe it was something more that he wasn't quite ready to name yet. Either way, he had the ring now, and he had a plan forming. The Preston Ranch sat in a valley about 5 miles outside of Pecos, protected from the worst of the weather by the surrounding hills. The main house was solid and well built, constructed from timber and stone over the course of 2 years. Carter had done most of the work himself, building something that would last, something that could be a real home if he ever found someone to share it with. That hadn't happened yet. The women in Pecos either saw him as a business opportunity or were already spoken for, and Carter had no interest in a marriage based on anything other than genuine feeling. His foreman, Miguel Rodriguez, was waiting in the barn when Carter arrived. Miguel had worked for the ranch for 6 years and had become more friend than employee over that time. "Boss, we have been checking the herd," Miguel said. "Everything looks good. They are handling the cold well enough." "Good." Carter dismounted and led his horse into the warmth of the barn. "Miguel, you know the widow Patterson? Lives in that little shack on the east side of town." Miguel's expression grew serious. "I know of her. I heard her husband died during a drive. Terrible thing. She has been alone. She is in trouble. I saw her trade her wedding ring for firewood today." Carter pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it up to catch the light from the lantern hanging on the barn wall. "I bought it back from Henderson." Miguel let out a low whistle. "You are planning something." "I am thinking she might need work, and we could use someone to help with the house. The place is too big for me to keep up on my own, especially during the busy seasons. It would give her a way to earn money, a place to stay that is warm and safe. And you would give her the ring back." Miguel's knowing look suggested he understood there was more to this than simple charity. "Eventually, when the time is right." Carter pocketed the ring again. "First, I need to make sure she will accept the help. Proud people often have a hard time with that." The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Carter rode into Pecos early before most people were up and about. He knocked on the door of Violet's shack, noticing how thin the walls were, how the wind cut through gaps in the wood. He had to knock twice before he heard movement inside. When Violet opened the door, she looked startled to see him. Carter removed his hat, suddenly aware that he hadn't fully thought through this part of his plan. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "my name is Carter Preston. I own a ranch outside of town." "I know who you are, Mr. Preston." Her voice was cautious, and he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on what had probably once been a fuller frame. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, I was hoping there was something I could do for you. I am in need of someone to help manage my household. The ranch house is large, and I am afraid I have let things get away from me. I need someone to handle the cooking, the cleaning, that sort of thing. The position would come with room and board, plus wages." Violet's eyes widened slightly, and he could see the hope and suspicion warring in her expression. "Why me? There are plenty of women in Pecos who could use the work." "Because I think you need it most," Carter said honestly, "and because I have a feeling you would do good work." "I am not offering charity, Mrs. Patterson. I genuinely need the help, and I am willing to pay fair wages for it." She stood silent for a long moment, and he could almost see her mind working through the implications, the potential problems, the question of propriety. A widow living alone on a ranch with a single man would set tongues wagging in a town the size of Pecos. "It would not be proper," she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Miguel Rodriguez, my foreman, lives in the bunkhouse with 2 other hands. You would have your own room in the main house, completely separate from mine. Anyone who wants to gossip will gossip regardless, but I give you my word that you would be treated with complete respect." Violet looked past him at the frozen street, then back at her shack with its meager fire already dying down. Carter could see the moment she made her decision. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Today, if you are willing. Bring whatever you want to keep. I will have Miguel come with a wagon to help move your things." "I do not have many things, Mr. Preston." "Then it will be an easy move." He settled his hat back on his head. "I will have Miguel here within the hour." True to his word, Miguel arrived with a wagon before the morning was half gone. Violet's possessions fit easily in the back. A small trunk of clothes, a few cooking implements, a quilt her mother had made, and a photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. She took one last look at the shack that had been her home and prison for the past few months, then climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Miguel. The ride to the ranch was quiet, Miguel respectfully giving her space with her thoughts. Violet watched the landscape roll by, the winter bare trees and frozen ground, the mountains in the distance still capped with snow. The ranch, when it came into view, was larger and more impressive than she'd expected. The main house stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from its chimney. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and she could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the white ground. Carter met them at the house, helping Violet down from the wagon with a steady hand. "Let me show you around," he said. The inside of the house was warm and spacious, with a large main room dominated by a stone fireplace, a kitchen that was bigger than her entire shack had been, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms. Carter showed her to the smallest one, which was still larger than any room she'd ever had to herself. "This would be yours," he said. "There is a lock on the door if it would make you feel more comfortable." Violet looked around the room with its sturdy bed, real glass window, and washstand. The floor was wood, not dirt, and the walls were solid. "It is more than I expected," she admitted. "I will leave you to get settled. Come down when you are ready and I will show you the kitchen. No need to start today if you are tired. Tomorrow is soon enough." But Violet, who had spent the past months feeling useless and helpless, needed to work. After putting her few belongings away, She came back downstairs and asked to see the kitchen. Carter showed her where everything was kept, explained his usual schedule, and introduced her to the pantry, which was better stocked than she'd dared hope. "I usually take breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, and supper around 6, he said. "But I am flexible if you need to adjust those times. That will be fine." Violet ran her hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen table, solid oak that had been crafted with care. "This is beautiful work." "I made it myself," Carter said, then seemed embarrassed by the admission. "I like working with wood when I have time." Over the next few weeks, Violet settled into a routine at the ranch. She woke early to prepare breakfast, spending her days cleaning and maintaining the house, cooking meals that were more substantial than anything she'd eaten in months. Carter was a considerate employer, always respectful, never demanding more than was reasonable. He worked long hours with his cattle, often coming in after dark covered in dust or mud, always careful to remove his boots at the door and thank her for the meal she'd prepared. She saw the ring once, quite by accident. She'd been putting away laundry in his room, as he'd given her permission to do, when she noticed it sitting on his dresser in a small wooden box. Her wedding ring, unmistakable in its simplicity. Her heart had stopped for a moment, confusion and something else flooding through her. Why did Carter Preston have her ring? Had he bought it from Henderson? But why would he do that? She didn't mention it to him, but the knowledge of it sat in her mind, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She began to watch Carter more carefully, noticing things she'd been too overwhelmed to see at first. The way he always made sure she'd eaten before he took his own meal. How he'd had Miguel install a better lock on her bedroom door without her asking, just to ensure she felt safe. The fact that he never raised his voice, never made her feel like a servant despite their arrangement. The winter slowly began to release its grip on the land. By early March, the first hints of spring were appearing, small green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. Violet had gained back the weight she'd lost, her face no longer gaunt with hunger and fear. She found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since Thomas died. Carter noticed the change in her, how she seemed less like a frightened bird ready to flee at any moment, and more like a woman finding her footing again. He'd catch himself watching her sometimes, the way she moved through his kitchen with growing confidence, how she'd started tending a small herb garden near the back door, preparing for the growing season ahead. He was falling in love with her, had probably been falling since the moment he'd seen her trade away her most precious possession just to survive, but he was careful to keep those feelings to himself. Violet was healing, but she was still healing. He wouldn't rush her, wouldn't take advantage of her dependence on him. The ring stayed in its box on his dresser, waiting for the right moment. One evening in late March, after supper had been cleared away, Violet found Carter on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She'd brought him coffee, and he accepted it with a smile. "It is beautiful," she said, looking out at the view. "I never took the time to notice things like this when I was in town." "Too busy surviving," Carter said quietly. "Yes." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was mild. "Mr. Preston, may I ask you something?" "Of course. And you can call me Carter." "Carter, then." She took a breath. "Why did you buy back my ring from Mr. Henderson?" He turned to look at her, and she met his gaze steadily. There was no accusation in her tone, only curiosity. "You saw it in my room," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I did. I have been wondering about it." Carter set down his coffee cup and leaned against the porch railing. "I saw you trade it away. I saw what it cost you to do that. I couldn't stand the thought of Henderson selling it off to someone who wouldn't understand what it meant, so I bought it back." I have been keeping it safe for you, for when you were ready to have it again." Violet felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "That was very kind of you. It seemed like the right thing to do." He paused, then added, "You loved your husband very much." "I did. Thomas was a good man. We had dreams, plans for the future, and then one moment of bad luck, one spooked horse, and it was all gone." She looked down at her bare left hand. "But I think he would understand that I had to trade the ring. Survival comes first. He would have wanted me to live." "I am sure he would have." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. Finally, Violet said, "I should go prepare for tomorrow." "Before you go," Carter said, reaching into his pocket. He'd started carrying the ring with him recently, though he hadn't fully admitted to himself why. "I think you should have this back." He held out the ring, and Violet stared at it in his palm. "I cannot pay you for it. I am not asking you to. It is yours. It always was." Violet reached out slowly, taking the ring from him. The metal was warm from being in his pocket, and the sight of it brought a rush of memories, both sweet and painful. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." She slipped it back onto her finger, where it settled like it had never left. But as she looked at it there, she realized something that surprised her. The ring no longer felt like a chain binding her to the past. It felt like a bridge, something that honored what had been while allowing her to move forward into what might be. That night, as Violet lay in her bed in the room Carter had given her, she thought about the man who'd given her a new chance at life. She thought about his quiet kindness, his respect, the way he'd returned something precious to her without demanding anything in return. Her feelings for him had been growing gradually, so slowly she hadn't fully recognized them until now. This wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love she'd felt for Thomas when they'd been young. This was something different, something deeper and steadier, built on gratitude and respect and genuine affection. The question was what to do about it. She was still wearing Thomas's ring, still technically in mourning. But she was also a practical woman who understood that life moved forward whether you were ready or not. Thomas was gone, and no amount of mourning would bring him back. And Carter was here, solid and real and good. Spring arrived in full force, transforming the ranch into a place of new life and growth. The cattle had calves, the grass grew green and lush, and Violet's herb garden flourished. She'd also planted vegetables, and Carter had built her raised beds to make the work easier, spending his evenings after long days with the herd working with wood and tools to create something useful and beautiful. They'd grown comfortable with each other, conversations flowing easily over meals and in quiet moments. Carter told her about building up the ranch, the challenges and triumphs, his hopes for the future. Violet shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, how she'd come west with Thomas seeking opportunity and adventure. She could talk about Thomas now without the sharp pain of fresh grief, and Carter listened without jealousy, understanding that honoring her past was important. One particularly warm day in May, Violet was working in her garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She straightened up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw Carter riding in with Miguel and another man she didn't recognize. They seemed agitated, and she felt a flutter of worry. Carter dismounted quickly, coming to where she stood. "We have a problem," he said. "There are rustlers working the area. Several ranches have lost cattle in the past week." "How many?" she asked. "Enough to matter. We are going to have to post guards at night, take shifts watching the herd. I wanted to let you know in case you hear people coming and going at odd hours." "Is it dangerous?" The worry in her voice was evident. "It can be, but we will be careful. These rustlers usually run at the first sign of resistance. They are looking for easy targets, and we will make sure we are not one." Over the next 2 weeks, Carter and his men took turns guarding the cattle at night. Violet found herself sleeping poorly, listening for sounds of trouble, worried about Carter's safety in a way that went beyond concern for an employer. She'd taken to leaving coffee and food ready for whoever was coming off watch, and Carter would often find her waiting in the kitchen when he returned in the early morning hours. "You should not be losing sleep over this," he told her one such morning, accepting the coffee she poured for him with grateful hands. "I cannot help it. I worry." "About the cattle?" he asked, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was hoping for a different answer. "About you," she said honestly. "I have lost enough. I do not want to lose any more." Carter set down his cup and looked at her across the kitchen table. "Violet, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her heart started beating faster. "All right. These past months, having you here, it has meant more to me than just having help with the house. You have become important to me. Very important." He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I know it might be too soon. I know you might still be mourning your husband, but I need to know if there is any chance you might feel the same way." Violet stood up and walked around the table to where he sat. She reached up and touched his face, rough with stubble after a long night out with the herd. "Carter Preston, I have been waiting for you to say something like that for weeks now." The kiss, when it came, was gentle and tentative, both of them testing new waters. But there was heat beneath the gentleness, a promise of more to come. When they finally pulled apart, Carter was smiling in a way she'd never seen before, open and joyful. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have loved you since I saw you give up everything just to survive a little longer." "I love you too," Violet replied. "You gave me back my life, but more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live it." They talked through the rest of the morning about feelings and hopes and what their future might look like. Carter asked if she would be his wife, properly and permanently, and Violet said yes without hesitation. They would wait until the rustler problem was resolved, but then they would go to the church in Pecos and make their commitment official. The rustlers made their move 3 nights later. Violet was awakened by the sound of gunshots in the distance and sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. She threw on a robe and ran downstairs, where Miguel burst through the door. "Mrs. Patterson, stay inside and lock the doors," he ordered. "The rustlers are trying to take part of the herd. The boss and the others are dealing with it." Violet wanted to argue, wanted to do something useful, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. She locked the doors after Miguel rushed back out, then found herself pacing the kitchen, praying harder than she'd prayed in months. She couldn't lose Carter, not now, not when she'd just found him. The gunshots continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then silence fell, heavy and ominous. Violet stood at the window, straining to see through the darkness, her hands twisted in her robe. Finally, she saw riders approaching the house. Her breath caught until she recognized Carter's silhouette in the lead. She unlocked the door and ran out to meet him. Carter dismounted and caught her in his arms, holding her tight. "It is over," he said. "They ran off. We managed to turn them back before they got any cattle." "Was anyone hurt?" "A few scratches, nothing serious." "The sheriff will want to know about this, but for tonight it is over." Violet pulled back just enough to look at his face. "I cannot do this," she said. Carter's expression fell. "Do what?" "I cannot wait until after the rustler problem is resolved to marry you. I cannot spend another night worrying that something might happen before I get the chance to be your wife. If you meant what you said about wanting to marry me, I want to do it soon as possible." A slow smile spread across Carter's face. Tomorrow," she agreed. They rode into Pecos the next morning. Carter in his best suit and Violet in the nicest dress she owned, a pale blue cotton she'd made herself. They went straight to the church, where the pastor agreed to marry them that afternoon, with Miguel and his wife Rosa standing as witnesses. It was simple and quick, nothing like the wedding Violet had had with Thomas, but it felt right in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the two people making the vows. When the pastor told Carter he could kiss his bride, the kiss was warm and full of promise. Violet felt Thomas's ring still on her finger, but it no longer felt like a symbol of the past holding her back. It was a reminder that she had loved and been loved, and that she was capable of loving again. They celebrated with a quiet dinner at the hotel in Pecos, then rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting. Carter lifted Violet down from her horse, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold of their home, making her laugh with delight. "I believe this is traditional," he said, setting her down gently in the front hall. "I believe you are right, Mr. Preston. That is Mr. Preston to you now too, Mrs. Preston." Their wedding night was tender and passionate. Two people who'd found each other against the odds finally able to express fully what they felt. Later, lying in Carter's arms in the bed that was now theirs to share, Violet felt a peace she hadn't known in nearly a year. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "What is that?" "I will always love Thomas. He was my first love, and what we had was real and good, but that does not diminish what I feel for you. If anything, it makes me appreciate it more, because I know how precious and rare this kind of love is." Carter pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I understand. I would not want you to forget him or pretend that part of your life did not happen. It made you who you are, and I love who you are." As spring turned to summer, Violet and Carter settled into married life. They worked the ranch together, Violet taking on more responsibilities beyond the household, helping with the cattle when extra hands were needed, managing the books with a sharp eye for numbers that impressed Carter. The ranch prospered under their joint care, and the respect the hands had for Carter extended to Violet as well. She kept Thomas's ring, but she no longer wore it on her left hand. Instead, she placed it on a chain around her neck, close to her heart, but no longer in the place reserved for a living husband. On her finger now sat a new ring, one Carter had commissioned from a jeweler in Santa Fe. It was more elaborate than the simple band Thomas had given her, with a small diamond set in gold filigree. Carter had presented it to her a month after their wedding, slipping it onto her finger as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. By the time the leaves started to turn in autumn, Violet suspected she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Carter, wanting to be sure. When she finally told him over breakfast one morning in October, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for. He'd picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down with concern that he might have hurt her. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said, laughing at his expression. I know. I just want to be careful." He placed his hand gently on her stomach, even though there was nothing to see yet. "A baby, our baby." "Are you happy?" "Violet, I am more than happy. I am blessed beyond measure." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Carter was attentive almost to the point of being overbearing, constantly worried about Violet doing too much or straining herself. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, understanding it came from love and perhaps a bit of fear. They'd both lost people they cared about. The thought of losing each other, or the baby they'd created together, was almost too much to contemplate. In early April of 1882, on a day when spring was making its presence known with warm sunshine and blooming wildflowers, Violet went into labor. Rosa Rodriguez, who'd helped deliver many babies in her time, came to the house along with the doctor from Pecos. Carter paced the downstairs while above him, Violet worked through the long hours of bringing their child into the world. When the baby's cry finally rang out, strong and healthy, Carter took the stairs 2 at a time. The doctor met him at the door with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Preston. Both mother and baby are doing well." Carter entered the bedroom to find Violet exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face of his son. "He is perfect," he breathed. "Would you like to hold him?" Violet asked. Carter took the baby carefully, supporting the small head the way Rosa had shown him during one of her instructional sessions. The baby's eyes were closed, his little mouth working as if already looking for milk. Carter felt something fundamental shift inside him, a fierce protective love unlike anything he'd experienced before. "What should we name him?" Violet asked. They discussed names but hadn't settled on anything definite. Carter looked at his wife, at the trust and love in her eyes, and made a decision. "I was thinking Thomas," he said. "After your first husband, it seems right to honor him that way." Tears filled Violet's eyes. "Are you sure? You do not have to do that, I am sure. He was a good man who loved you and you loved him. Our son can carry his name with pride." "Thomas Carter Preston," Violet said, trying it out. "Yes, that is perfect." Little Thomas thrived, growing strong and healthy through the spring and summer. Carter proved to be a devoted father, often found holding his son even when the baby was sleeping, just wanting to be close to him. Violet watched her husband with their child and felt her heart swell with love for both of them. The ranch continued to prosper. With the money they'd saved, Carter was able to buy additional land from a neighbor who was retiring and moving back east. The Preston Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the territory, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. As Thomas grew from baby to toddler, Violet found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was a little harder, and she was more tired, but she made it through with Carter's support. In the winter of 1884, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Carter's mother. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, of seasons changing and children growing. Thomas proved to be a serious child, thoughtful and careful like his father, while Rose was full of energy and mischief from the moment she could crawl. The house that Carter had built alone became a true home, filled with laughter and love and the controlled chaos of family life. On their 5th anniversary, Carter and Violet stood on the porch as they so often did, watching the sunset paint the sky. Thomas was 6 now, playing in the yard with Rose while Miguel's oldest son kept an eye on them. Violet leaned against her husband, comfortable and content. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked. "All the time," Carter replied. "I think about how close I came to not walking out of that store at the exact moment you were trading your ring. If I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later, I never would have seen you, never would have thought to help. I think about how desperate I was that day," Violet said. "How lost I felt. I truly believed my life was over, that I'd just be surviving until I could not survive anymore. And now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. A husband I love, beautiful children, a home that actually feels like a home. Sometimes I feel guilty about how happy I am." Carter turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Do not feel guilty. You have earned this happiness. You survived when survival was nearly impossible. You had the courage to accept help when it was offered, and you had the strength to love again after loss. None of this was handed to you. You made it happen." "We made it happen," she corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." "Then we are agreed that we are both remarkable people who deserve their happiness," Carter said with a smile. Violet laughed and kissed him. "Agreed." The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning everything Carter could teach him about cattle and land management. Rose surprised everyone by developing a talent for horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and intuition. In 1887, Violet gave birth to another son whom they named Daniel, and 2 years after that came Margaret, completing their family of 6. The Preston Ranch became known throughout New Mexico Territory as a place of integrity and prosperity. Carter took on the role of community leader naturally, helping settle disputes and advocating for improvements to schools and roads. Violet became known for her charity work, never forgetting what it was like to be desperate and alone. She made sure that any widow or struggling family in the area knew they could come to the Preston Ranch for help, whether that meant food, work, or just advice and support. On a spring day in 1895, Violet was working in her garden, now extensive and beautiful, when Thomas came running from the barn. "Ma, there is a woman at the gate. She looks like she needs help." Violet straightened up, wiping dirt from her hands. "Bring her to the house. I will put water on for tea." The woman who arrived was young, probably not more than 20, thin and worn-looking. She reminded Violet painfully of her own younger self, desperate and running out of options. "My name is Sarah," the woman said quietly. "I heard in town that you sometimes help people who are in need. My husband died last month, and I have been trying to make it on my own, but I am failing. I have nothing left to sell, nowhere else to turn." Violet took the young woman's hands in hers. "You have come to the right place. My name is Violet Preston. A long time ago I was exactly where you are now. I know what it feels like to believe you are out of options. But you are not. There are always options, and we will help you find them." Over tea and sandwiches, Violet learned that Sarah had some skill with sewing and mending. By the time Carter came in for dinner, Violet had already worked out a plan. Sarah would stay with them for a few weeks, helping with household tasks while Violet taught her better sewing skills. Then they would help her set up as a seamstress in Pecos, where there was definitely a need. It was the same kind of practical help that Carter had given Violet all those years ago, a hand up rather than a handout. As Violet explained the plan to Carter, Sarah began to cry with relief. "I do not know how to thank you." "Thank us by building a good life for yourself," Carter said. "And someday, when you are in a position to help someone else, do it. That is how we pay these things forward." True to their word, the Prestons helped Sarah get established. Within 6 months, she had a thriving seamstress business and had even started courting one of the clerks from the general store. At her wedding the following year, she asked Violet to stand up with her, an honor Violet accepted with tears in her eyes. The children grew and eventually began lives of their own. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from Las Cruces and built a house on the northern section of the Preston land, managing that portion while Carter handled the rest. Rose shocked everyone by moving to California, where she started a horse breeding operation that became quite successful. Daniel decided ranching was not for him and went east to study law, eventually becoming a lawyer in Denver. Margaret, the youngest, stayed closest to home, marrying a local veterinarian and settling in Pecos itself. Through it all, Carter and Violet remained the constant center of their growing family. As they aged, their love for each other only deepened, built on years of shared experiences, challenges overcome together, and unwavering mutual support. On a summer evening in 1910, Carter and Violet sat on the porch of their home, now weathered by nearly 30 years of sun and wind, but still solid and strong. They were in their late 50s and early 60s now, no longer young but far from old, still active in running the ranch though Thomas handled more of the day-to-day operations. "You remember the first time we sat here together?" Carter asked. "When I gave you back your ring?" "Of course I remember. That was the night I started to understand that I might have a future after all, that there might be more to life than just surviving." Carter reached over and took her hand, the one that still wore the ring he'd given her, though Thomas's ring remained on its chain around her neck. "I was so nervous that night. I was already in love with you, but I was terrified that it was too soon, that you would think I was taking advantage." "I knew," Violet said softly. "You knew what? That you loved me. I could see it in everything you did, every consideration and kindness. It made me feel safe enough to let myself fall in love with you in return." "I have never regretted a single moment," Carter said. "Not one. Every day with you has been a gift. Even when Rose decided to move to California and nearly gave you a heart attack," Carter laughed. "Even then, she has your stubborn independence. I could not really hold that against her." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset as they'd done thousands of times before. Grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm air. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and well-managed, a legacy they'd built together. "Thank you," Violet said suddenly. "For what?" "For seeing me that day, for caring enough to help, for giving me back my ring and in doing so giving me back my life." She turned to face him. "You saved me, Carter Preston, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," he replied. "I was building this place, making it successful, but it was empty without someone to share it with. You made it a home. You made me whole." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, they kissed, a gentle affirmation of everything they'd built together. The ring on Violet's finger caught the last rays of light, glinting like a promise kept. In the years that followed, they would see more grandchildren born, would celebrate more milestones and weather more challenges. They would dance at more weddings and rock more babies and continue to build the legacy they'd started when Violet had been desperate enough to trade away her most precious possession, and Carter had been compassionate enough to give it back. And every year on their anniversary, Carter would take Violet's hand, the one with his ring on it, and thank her for saying yes to him all those years ago. And every year, Violet would touch the chain around her neck, where Thomas's ring still hung, and silently thank her first husband for teaching her how to love deeply, because that knowledge had allowed her to love again when the time came. Their story became something of a legend in Pecos and the surrounding area. People would point out Mrs. Preston, who'd once been so desperate she'd traded her wedding ring for firewood, and Mr. Preston, the lonely rancher who'd given her a new one. They became symbols of second chances and the power of compassion, proof that even in the harsh landscape of the West, love and kindness could not only survive but thrive. When Carter and Violet were in their 70s, too old to work the ranch actively anymore but still sharp in mind and spirit, they would sit on that same porch and watch Thomas run the operation with his own sons learning at his side. They would see Rose when she visited from California, successful and confident, exactly who she was meant to be. They would receive letters from Daniel about his cases and his growing family. And they would watch Margaret in town, her veterinary practice keeping her busy but never too busy to visit her parents regularly. "We did well," Violet said one evening, speaking of their children and the lives they'd built. "We did very well," Carter agreed, "though I cannot take much credit. You were the one who actually raised them while I was out with the cattle. You taught them how to work hard and be fair. That was just as important." They watched the sunset, as they always did, the sky performing its nightly show of color and light. Violet's hair was white now, Carter's more salt than pepper, but their hands still fit together perfectly, worn and weathered by decades of work and life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently?" Violet asked. "If I had frozen to death that winter, or if you had not seen me trade the ring?" "I try not to think about that," Carter said honestly. "The idea of a world where we never found each other is too sad to contemplate." "I think we were meant to find each other," Violet said. "I think everything that happened, as painful as some of it was, led us to exactly where we needed to be." "I agree, though I wish you had not had to suffer to get there. The suffering made me appreciate what we have. I do not think I would value this life as much if I had not known what it was like to have nothing." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their grandchildren came to say good night, as they did every evening when they were visiting. There were 8 of them now, ranging in age from toddler to teenager, and each one received hugs and kisses from their grandparents before heading off to bed. After the children were gone, Carter and Violet remained on the porch a while longer. The night air was warm and pleasant, and neither was ready to go inside just yet. "I love you," Carter said, the words as true now as they'd been 35 years ago when he'd first spoken them. "I love you too," Violet replied. "Always have, always will." They made their way inside eventually, Carter helping Violet navigate the steps that had gotten a bit more challenging as arthritis set into her knees. They moved through their nightly routine with the comfort of long practice, preparing for bed in the room they'd shared for decades. As they lay together in the darkness, Violet's head on Carter's shoulder, his arm around her waist, they both felt the deep contentment of a life well lived and love well earned. "Good night, my love," Carter whispered. "Good night," Violet replied. They would wake together the next morning as they had thousands of mornings before, ready to face another day. There would be breakfast to prepare, ranch business to discuss with Thomas, grandchildren to spoil, and a sunset to watch from the porch. The days stretched ahead of them, each one a gift, each one another chance to be together. The story of how they met, of the ring traded and returned, of love found in the hardest of circumstances, would be passed down through their family for generations. It would become part of the Preston legacy, a reminder that kindness matters, that second chances are possible, and that love, real love, can transform everything. And on that spring day back in 1881, when Violet had stood in the cold trading away her most precious possession, she could never have imagined the life she would eventually build. She could not have known that the lonely rancher watching from across the street would become the love of her life, the father of her children, her partner in building something lasting and good. But that was the beauty of it. Life had a way of surprising you, of turning your darkest moments into doorways to something better. All you had to do was have the courage to walk through when the opportunity presented itself, and the wisdom to recognize help when it was offered. Violet had found that courage and wisdom, and Carter had offered his hand at exactly the right moment. Together, they'd built a life that honored both their pasts and their future, a life filled with love and family and purpose. In the end, that was all anyone could ask for. And it was more than enough. It was everything. The Preston Ranch continued to thrive long after Carter and Violet were gone, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own story to the legacy while remembering the 2 people who'd started it all. The porch where they'd watched countless sunsets became a family gathering place, where their descendants would sit and tell the story of how it all began. With a widow trading her wedding ring for firewood in the desperate winter of 1881, and a lonely rancher who saw her struggle and decided to help, who gave back what she'd lost and in doing so, gave her everything she'd never dared to hope for. It was a love story. It was a story of survival and second chances. It was proof that even in the hardest times, in the roughest places, human kindness and genuine love could not only exist but flourish. And it was a story that deserved to be remembered, to be passed down, to remind people that we are all capable of changing someone's life with a simple act of compassion. We are all capable of being the person who gives back what was lost, who offers a hand when it is needed most, who recognizes the value in another human being even when they cannot see it in themselves. Carter and Violet Preston lived that truth every day of their long lives together. And the life they built, the family they raised, and the love they shared stood as testament to the power of choosing kindness, of believing in second chances, and of having the courage to love again even after loss. Their story began with a ring traded in desperation and returned in compassion. It continued with a love that grew steadily and surely, built on respect and genuine affection. And it ended, many decades later, with two people who had lived fully and loved deeply, surrounded by the family and legacy they'd created together. In the harsh landscape of the Wild West, where survival was never guaranteed and comfort was hard-won, Carter and Violet had found something rare and precious. They'd found each other, and in doing so, they'd found home. Not just a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging and purpose that sustained them through everything life threw their way. And when the story was told, as it was often in the Preston family, it always ended the same way, with a reminder to be kind, to help where you can, and to never underestimate the power of a single compassionate act. Because you never knew when that act might change not just one life, but generations of lives to come. The ring that Violet had traded for firewood, that Carter had bought back and returned to her, eventually became a family heirloom, passed down to Thomas, and then to his daughter. But the new ring Carter had given Violet, the one with the diamond set in gold filigree, that remained on her finger for the rest of her life, and was buried with her when she finally passed, surrounded by her family, at the age of 83. Carter followed her 2 years later, his heart simply giving out one quiet morning as he sat on the porch watching the sunrise. He was found with a smile on his face, and in his pocket was a photograph of Violet from their early years together. They were buried side by side in the cemetery outside Pico's, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names, dates, and a single inscription chosen by their children. They gave each other everything. It was a simple epitaph for a complicated and beautiful life, but it was true. They had given each other everything that mattered: love, respect, partnership, family, and a life worth living. From the darkest winter to the brightest spring, from desperate survival to comfortable prosperity, they had walked the journey together. And that was how the story ended. Not with tragedy or drama, but with a life well lived, and a love that had stood the test of time. With children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values and lessons of the couple who'd started it all. With a ranch that continued to thrive, a family that remained close, and a legend that grew with each telling. The lonely rancher had given the desperate widow a new ring, yes. But more than that, he'd given her hope, dignity, and a future. And she had given him purpose, family, and a home that was truly a home. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and kindness that would ripple forward through time, touching lives they would never know. And if you traveled to Pico's even today, you would still hear stories about the Prestons, about the ranch they built and the love they shared. People would tell you about Violet, who'd been brave enough to survive impossible circumstances, and Carter, who'd been compassionate enough to help her. They would tell you about a ring traded and returned, about a love that grew from kindness into something extraordinary. Because some stories are worth remembering. Some stories deserve to be told and retold, passed down through generations as reminders of what is possible when people choose compassion over indifference, when they choose to help rather than turn away. The story of Carter and Violet Preston was one of those stories. And it would live on, a testament to the transformative power of love and kindness, for as long as there were people willing to listen and learn from the simple truth it contained. That we all have the power to change someone's life, and sometimes all it takes is seeing their struggle and choosing to help. The rest, as they say, is history. Beautiful, meaningful, love-filled history.